Welcome to Bedtime Music Biographies. Let the sleep begin.
There is a city in the northwest of England, a port city on a brown river, that for most of its life had been a place from which people left. They left for America. They left for Australia. They left for whatever ship would take them. The city had been bombed in the war more heavily than almost any place in Britain outside of London, and the spaces between its houses, well into the 1950s, were the spaces left by the bombs. Children played in those spaces. They climbed the rubble. They peered into the cellars of houses that were no longer there. And 4 of those children, born within a few years and a few miles of one another, would, before any of them turned 30, become the most famous human beings on the surface of the earth. Their names for the birth certificates were John Winston Lennon, James Paul McCartney, George Harold Harrison, and Richard Starkey. Everyone who ever knew them eventually called them by the names they came to: John, Paul, George, Ringo. And this is their story as a band told slowly, in the way such a story ought to be told, from the summer afternoon in 1957, when 2 of them met at a church fete in a Liverpool suburb, through the long apprenticeship and the strange explosion and the records that changed what records were, to the spring of 1970 when the band ended. You can let it wash over you. You do not have to hold on to the dates. The story will go where it goes, and it will bring you in its own time to the place where it ends. The records they made are the spine of this. The lives are the context that produced them. We will move more or less from album to album, because the albums are how they themselves understood the years going by, and they are how the years are best remembered. Around each record will be the life of the band at the time it was made, the clubs they were playing, the drugs they were taking, the people they were meeting, the producer at the console, the engineer at the tape machine, the room in the building on Abbey Road where almost all of it happened. So settle in. The lights are low now. Liverpool is a long way away and a long time ago, and we are going to begin, in the next few minutes, on a summer afternoon in 1957, in the back garden of a small church in a suburb called Woolton, on a bright day in July. Chapter 1. 2 Boys at a Garden Fete. John Winston Lennon was born on the 9th of October, 1940, in Liverpool Maternity Hospital, in the middle of the German air raids that were, that year, falling on the city night after night. His mother was Julia Stanley, a bright, pretty, slightly unconventional woman who would, in the years that followed, struggle to provide a stable home for the boy. His father, Alfred Lennon, was a merchant seaman and was not often there. By the time John was 5 years old, the marriage had effectively ended, and the boy had been taken in by Julia's older sister, a stricter, more practical woman named Mimi Smith, who lived with her husband George in a small but neat semi-detached house in the Liverpool suburb of Woolton, on a road called Menlove Avenue. Mimi loved the boy fiercely and raised him as if he were her own. Julia, his mother, lived a short distance away and would come and visit, and would, as he got older, become for John a kind of glamorous second figure, the parent who let him do what Mimi did not. When he was 16 years old, his mother was killed in a road accident, struck by a car driven by an off-duty police officer outside Mimi's house. The loss would shape everything in him for the rest of his life. He was, as a boy, clever, sharp-tongued, restless, and trouble. He drew, he read, he was funny in the cruel way unhappy boys are funny. He was, by the time he reached his middle teens, in the grip of the new American music that was beginning to arrive in Liverpool through the merchant ships and the radio. Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Buddy Holly, the skiffle craze, led by an Englishman named Lonnie Donegan, had given thousands of British teenagers the idea that they could make this music themselves, on cheap guitars and washboards and tea-chest basses. John formed a skiffle group at his school, the Quarry Bank High School, and called it, after the school, the Quarrymen. They played at parties. They played at school fetes. They played wherever a group of teenagers with 3 chords between them could be persuaded to play. On the 6th of July, 1957, the Quarrymen played at the summer fete of St. Peter's Church in Woolton, a few minutes' walk from Mimi's house. The fete was the ordinary kind of village afternoon. There was a procession with the Rose Queen on a flatbed truck. There were stalls selling cakes. There was a tug-of-war and a brass band, and in the late afternoon, on a small wooden stage in the churchyard, the Quarrymen played a short set of skiffle and rock and roll. John, then 16, sang. He had a way of standing at the microphone, slightly hunched, slightly insolent, that already, even at that age, drew the eye. In the audience, watching, was a boy of 15 named Paul McCartney. He had cycled over from his house in Allerton with a friend, Ivan Vaughan, who was in the band, and who had said John might be interested to meet him. Paul was younger, neater, more conventionally handsome than John, with a left-handed way of holding a guitar and an unusual willingness, for a boy of his age, to actually learn the chords properly. His mother, Mary McCartney, a midwife much loved in the neighbourhood, had died of cancer the previous autumn, when Paul was 14. He had a younger brother, Michael, and a father, Jim, a former cotton salesman and amateur dance band leader who kept music in the house. Paul, like John, had been pulled into music partly by the new American sounds and partly by the loss in the family that had made him want, very badly, something he could throw himself into. The standard story of that afternoon is that Paul met John for the first time after the Quarrymen's performance in the church hall and demonstrated the chords to Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock and Gene Vincent's Bebopper Lula, and tuned John's guitar properly, which John had not known how to do, and impressed John enough that, within a week or two, John had Ivan ask Paul if he wanted to join. Mark Lewison, in his exhaustive biography Tune In, has noted that Paul has, in private moments, suggested he and John may have crossed paths earlier, on a bus or at a chip shop in the neighbourhood, before the formal introduction. Whatever the precise sequence, the meeting at the Woolton fete is the moment that has come to stand for the beginning, and it has earned its place. From that afternoon onward, the two of them were connected, and the Quarrymen had, although none of them yet knew it, the writing partnership that would, over the next decade, produce more or less the songs that the second half of the 20th century would sing. Paul, once he was in the band, brought along a younger friend from the bus he rode to school, a quiet, sharp-faced boy who could play the guitar a great deal better than either John or Paul could. His name was George Harrison. He was 14. John, a sophisticate of 16, did not at first want a 14-year-old in his band. Paul kept pushing. There is a story, much repeated, of George being asked to audition for John on the upper deck of a Liverpool bus, on the way back from a gig, and playing the instrumental Raunchy, which was, at the time, a recent American hit. He played it cleanly. He played it correctly. John relented. By the early months of 1958, the band had 3 of its eventual 4 members in place, although it would still take more than 4 years, and a 5th city before the 4th would arrive. George had been born on the 25th of February, 1943, in a small house on Arnold Grove in Liverpool. He was the youngest of 4 children. His father drove a bus. His mother encouraged the music, even bought him his first cheap guitar, because she could see what it meant to him. He was, by temperament, the most reserved of the 3. While John and Paul wrote songs, George practiced. While John and Paul argued about lyrics, George worked out the lead lines. He would, for many years, be regarded, including by John and Paul themselves, as the junior partner. It would take a decade before he would emerge, not as the third Beatle, but as a songwriter as gifted in his own way as the other two. But all of that lay ahead. What lay between them and any of it, in the late 1950s, was the long, slow, unglamorous work of trying to be a band. They played weddings. They played youth clubs. They lost members and gained them. A boy named Stuart Sutcliffe, a thin, beautiful, brilliant art student and a close friend of John's from the Liverpool College of Art, joined them on bass in early 1960, partly because he had won a small art prize and could afford to buy a bass guitar with the money. He could not particularly play it. He stood on stage with his back half turned to the audience and tried to look like Gene Vincent. John loved him. The rest of them tolerated him. They went through a series of band names, each one slightly more hopeful than the last. Johnny and the Moondogs, the Beatles, the Silver Beatles, after Buddy Holly's Crickets, and then dropping the silver and changing the second E to an A in tribute to the beat music they were now playing, the Beatles. They needed a drummer. A boy named Pete Best, the dark, handsome son of a woman named Mona Best who ran a coffee club in her cellar called the Casbah, where the Quarrymen had played some of their earliest gigs, was available and could play and had a drum kit. They asked him to join. He said yes. And with that, in August of 1960, the lineup was complete. John, Paul, George, Stuart, and Pete. 5 young men with not very much money, not very much experience, and a great deal of restless conviction. They were about to leave Liverpool for the first time in their lives. They were going, of all places, to Hamburg. Chapter 2. Hamburg. There is a kind of toughness that is forged only in conditions a person would not, in retrospect, choose. The Beatles, when they went to Hamburg in the late summer of 1960, were not yet a serious band. They were 5 Liverpool boys with a few dozen songs, mostly other people's, and a precarious confidence. When they came back from the last of their 5 Hamburg residencies in late 1962, they were one of the tightest, most powerful live acts in Europe. The thing that turned them into that was Hamburg itself. A small-time Liverpool promoter named Alan Williams had, in the spring of 1960, been trying to broker an arrangement with a German club owner named Bruno Koschmieder, who ran a few low-rent music venues in the rougher quarters of Hamburg and who needed live English groups to draw drinkers. Williams sent another Liverpool group first. When they did well, Koschmieder asked for another. Williams, somewhat scrambling, offered him the Beatles. Koschmieder said yes. And on the 16th of August, 1960, the 5 of them, with their amplifiers and their borrowed van, drove south to Harwich, took a ferry across the Channel, and made their way overland to Hamburg, a city most of them had not heard much about, in a country whose recent history had ended, for the British 15 years earlier. The neighbourhood they were sent to was the St. Pauli quarter, near the harbour, on a long street called the Reeperbahn. The Reeperbahn was, in the 1960s, one of the most notorious red-light districts in Europe. It was a strip of clubs, bars, brothels and music halls, frequented by sailors of every nationality, by local criminals, by the prostitutes who worked the side streets, and into the small hours by anyone in Hamburg who had not yet gone home to bed. Koschmieder's main club was called the Indra. He put the Beatles up to play there. Their lodgings, which was a generous word for them, were a couple of windowless rooms behind the screen of a small pornographic cinema he also owned called the Bambi Kino. They slept on cots. The toilets were the cinemas. The rooms smelled of damp and disinfectant and stale popcorn. None of them complained very much because none of them had been anywhere before, and the strangeness of the situation was, for boys of 19 and 20, more thrilling than appalling. The hours they were asked to play were the staggering thing, 6 nights a week, up to 8 hours a night. There was no possibility of relying on a 45-minute set of polished songs. They had to keep going. They had to play every song they knew multiple times a night and stretch them and improvise on them and mock them and turn them inside out in front of an audience that was usually drunk, sometimes violent, and almost always indifferent until something on the stage caught its attention. Koschmider would shout at them in his broken English to make a show, mach schau. And so they did. John would do an exaggerated, limping Hitler impression. Paul would scream at the top of his lungs in the manner of Little Richard. They would jump on tables. They would leap off the stage. They would, in time, become a band that could hold a room of sailors at 4 in the morning by sheer noise and force of will. They could not have done it without help. Within a few weeks of arriving, they began to be supplied by a sympathetic waitress and by other club staff, with an over-the-counter German diet pill called Preludin. Preludin was, in chemical terms, an amphetamine. It killed the appetite, kept the user awake for many hours, and in the dosages the boys were taking, produced a wired, talkative, slightly manic state that allowed them to play through the night and onward into the dawn. They would chew them like sweets. They would wash them down with bottles of beer pressed into their hands by audience members. They would come off stage after 8 hours of playing, still wired, and walk back to the Bambi Kino in the cold pre-dawn light, and try, sometimes successfully and sometimes not, to fall asleep. Within a month, they were not the band they had been when they arrived. They were faster, louder, harder, tighter. They had lost any inhibition about what would or would not work in front of a crowd. They had become, in a small backstreet club on the Reeperbahn, a working rock and roll band. In October of that first Hamburg season, 3 young Germans walked into the Kaiserkeller, where the Beatles had by then moved, having been lured away from the Indra by Koschmider's rival club. The 3 were art students from the Hamburg Meisterschule, a small group of self-styled bohemians who called themselves, after the French existentialists they admired, the Exis. Their names were Klaus Voormann, Jürgen Vollmer, and Astrid Kircher. Voormann had wandered in alone the night before after an argument with his girlfriend and had been transfixed by the Liverpool boys on stage. He came back the next night with the others. Astrid in particular was struck, the moment she walked through the door, by the strange beauty of Stuart Sutcliffe, the bass player who could not really play and whose silhouette against the stage lights had a quality, she would later say, of something out of a film. Astrid was 22. She was a working photographer, the assistant to a respected Hamburg photographer named Reinhard Wolf. She was small, blonde, dressed in black leather, intensely serious about art and music and clothes and hair. Within a few weeks, she and Stuart were inseparable. Within a few months, they were engaged. She took him home to her mother's house in the suburb of Altona, and he, who had never known anything like it, moved in. She photographed all 5 of the Beatles in a Hamburg fairground, in striking black and white compositions that would, decades later, be among the most reproduced rock photographs of the 20th century. She cut Stuart's hair, dropping the slicked-back rocker style they had all been wearing into a forward-combed fringe that the others eventually would all adopt. The Beatle haircut, when the world saw it in 1963 and 1964 and decided it was an outrage and a phenomenon, had been worn already in 1960 by Klaus Formann and Jürgen Vollmer and the whole Exi crowd, who had got it from their reading of French magazines. Astrid took it, with her scissors, off Stuart's head and put it onto the rest of them. They wore it for the rest of their lives. The first Hamburg trip ended abruptly in late November. George, who was still 17, was discovered by the Hamburg police to be under the legal age of 18 for working in a nightclub past the curfew and was deported. Paul and Pete, in the course of moving out of the Bambi Kino, set fire to a condom on a wall in their cinema room, more as a small act of vandalism than as anything serious, and were arrested for arson and deported. John and Stuart followed separately a few weeks later. They went home to Liverpool in the depths of December, broke, exhausted, transformed. They had been a band of teenagers when they left. They came back in their own minds, and increasingly in the minds of anyone who heard them. Something else. There were 4 more Hamburg trips between the spring of 1961 and the end of 1962. The Top 10 Club, the Star Club. Each one shorter than the last, each one consolidating what the first had begun. In April of 1961, on the second Hamburg trip, they made their first commercial recordings as the backing band for an English singer named Tony Sheridan. They played on a record of a German version of My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean, released on the Polydor label under the name Tony Sheridan and the Beat Brothers. The record meant nothing in itself, but a copy of it eventually would find its way back to Liverpool and onto the counter of a record shop run by a young man named Brian Epstein. And from there a story would begin that the boys themselves were not yet ready for. Stuart Sutcliffe did not come home from Hamburg. He had decided by the second residency that he wanted to be a painter rather than a Beatle, and to stay in Hamburg with Astrid, and to study at the Meisterschule under Eduardo Paolozzi, who had become his teacher and mentor. Paul moved over from rhythm guitar, a little reluctantly, to bass. Stuart and Astrid set up a household in Altona. The Beatles came and went. And then, on the 10th of April, 1962, while the band was preparing to fly to Hamburg for what would be the third residency, Stuart died in Astrid's arms on the way to the hospital. He had been suffering for months from increasingly severe headaches. The autopsy attributed the death to a brain hemorrhage. He was 21 years old. The cause has been argued about ever since. There had been a fight in Liverpool a year or 2 earlier in which Stuart had been kicked in the head, and some have wondered whether the injury, undiagnosed at the time, contributed. Others have pointed to the relentless schedule and the amphetamines. Astrid, for the rest of her long life, refused to speculate. She kept his paintings. She kept his memory. She lived until her own death in 2020 as the woman who had loved him. The Beatles arrived in Hamburg the next day, having heard the news on the tarmac. Astrid was at the airport to meet them. John, in particular, took it badly. He had loved Stuart in a way he had not quite loved any of the others. He covered the grief in the only way he knew how, with cruelty and jokes. The band played its season and went home and prepared for what was coming next, which neither they nor anyone else could yet have known was about to be everything. Chapter 3. Brian and Mr. Martin and the drummer who had to go. At about the time the Beatles were returning home from their first Hamburg trip, a young man named Brian Epstein was running, with a kind of meticulous and unhappy seriousness, the record department of his family's electronics shop on Whitechapel Street in Liverpool. The shop was called North End Music Stores, NEMS for short. Brian was 27, the son of a respected Liverpool family of furniture and music retailers, Jewish in a city with a small but established Jewish community, and gay in a country where being gay was, until 1967, a criminal offence. He had, in his short life so far, tried and abandoned the army, drama school at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, and the family business twice. He was, by every account, a charming, anxious, lonely, and immaculately dressed person. What he was not when the story finds him in late 1961 was anyone in the music business. He had never managed a band. He had never been to a rock and roll show. The story has it that on the 28th of October, 1961, a young man came into Nems and asked for a record called My Bonnie by Tony Sheridan and the Beat Brothers. The record was a German Polydor pressing. The boy who asked for it told Brian, who handled the request personally, that the backing band on the record was a Liverpool group called the Beatles, who played regularly at a club just a few minutes' walk from the shop, in the basement of an old fruit warehouse on Matthew Street. The club was called the Cavern. Brian had not heard of any of this, but he ordered the record. And his curiosity, which was always strong, prompted him to walk over, on the 9th of November at lunchtime, to see for himself what these Beatles were. The Cavern at lunchtime was a low, dripping, tiled cellar, full of office girls and apprentices on their break, eating sandwiches in the warm, smoky dark, while bands played on a small stage at the far end. Brian, in his expensive suit, stood at the back. The Beatles were on stage. They were funny. They were rude. They smoked between songs. They ate sandwiches between songs. They turned their backs on the audience to tune, and then they would launch into a song, and the room would lift. And Brian, who had never seen anything quite like this in his careful life, would later say that he understood, that day, that he was watching something he had to be a part of. He went home and, after some weeks of thinking, contacted them through a mutual acquaintance and asked to meet. They met in the back room of Nems in early December. By the end of January 1962, he had become their manager. What Brian Epstein gave the Beatles in the months that followed was a transformation of presentation. He persuaded them gently to stop eating on stage. He persuaded them to stop smoking on stage. He persuaded them to bow at the end of songs in unison, the way the older showband leaders had done, and in a decision that has been the subject of much later folk wisdom, he persuaded them to put on suits. The story has often been told that John Lennon hated the suits and was forced into them against his will, and Mark Lewisohn, in Tune In, has gently corrected this. The Beatles were not, by 1962, blind to the need for a different kind of presentation. They wanted to play bigger venues. They wanted eventually to be on television. They went, with Brian, to a tailor named Benno Dawn and chose themselves the cut and colour of the suits they would wear. The decision, when it came, was a collective one. The image, the soft-tailored collarless jackets that would in time be borrowed in modified form on the cover of Sgt. Pepper, and the matching trousers and the matching boots, was the work of all of them, with Brian's coaxing. What Brian had not yet done was get them a record contract. He spent the first half of 1962 in London, going from record company to record company, carrying a tape of the Beatles in his briefcase, and being told, with various degrees of politeness, that guitar groups were on their way out, and that he should perhaps look into helping his family with the furniture business. The most famous of these rejections came on the 1st of January 1962, when the Beatles drove down from Liverpool, having loaded their equipment into a van in a snowstorm, and played a 15-song audition for a producer at Decca Records named Mike Smith. They played covers mostly, with 3 Lennon-McCartney originals. Smith was friendly. Smith said he liked them. Decca, after some weeks of internal deliberation, declined. The label decided instead to sign a London group called Brian Poole and the Tremolos. The Tremolos had been auditioned the same day. They lived closer to London. They were, the Decca executive said, the safer bet. The Decca tapes have been released, in the long years since, on various unauthorized and authorized compilations. Listeners can decide for themselves whether the Beatles played a strong audition or a weak one. The covers are competent. Paul's vocal, "Until There Was You," is sweet and accurate. John's sounds, on some of the harder rock songs, a little subdued, possibly because of the cold and the snow and the hour. The Decca rejection has come to stand, in the canon of music industry mistakes, for the supreme example of the well-paid executive who turned down the obvious. The truth, as so often, is a little more complicated. The Beatles on that audition tape were a working club band, not yet a recording proposition in the way they would become. Decca's mistake was not in failing to see genius on the day. It was in failing to see what the band was on its way to becoming. What rescued them from the rejection was, of all unlikely things, a tape transfer. A man at HMV Record Store on Oxford Street in London, to whom Brian had taken the Decca tape to have it cut to acetate so he could continue showing it around, listened to it as he worked and put Brian in touch with a music publisher who put him in touch with a producer at the Parlophone label of EMI named George Martin. Parlophone was, at the time, the smallest and least glamorous of the EMI labels, more known for novelty records and comedy releases than for pop. George Martin, who ran it, was 36, tall, exquisitely well-spoken, classically trained, and bored. He had been told that he should perhaps find a guitar group who could compete with Cliff Richard and the Shadows. He met Brian. He listened to the tape. He was not particularly impressed, but he agreed, on the strength of Brian's evident faith in the boys, to bring them down to London for a test session. That session took place at EMI's studios on Abbey Road, in St. John's Wood, on the 6th of June, 1962. It was the first time the Beatles had set foot in the building that would, over the next 8 years, become more associated with them than any other building on Earth. They played for George Martin and his engineer, Norman Smith. They were nervous. They were unimpressive. Their amps had been damaged in transit and had to be repaired. The drummer, Pete Best, played in his standard heavy four-on-the-floor style, which Martin found wooden. After the audition, Martin gathered the boys together in the control room, gave them an honest professional critique, and asked, near the end, if there was anything they did not like. After a brief silence, George Harrison, the youngest, said with characteristic Liverpudlian dryness that he did not like Martin's tie. Martin laughed. The mood broke. He decided, on the strength of that exchange, more than anything in the music, that there was something here he could work with. He offered them a contract. There was, however, the matter of the drummer. Martin had told Brian that, while he was happy enough with the others, he would prefer to use a session drummer for the actual recording sessions. The other 3 Beatles, who had been thinking similar thoughts for some time, took Martin's verdict as the permission they had been waiting for. Pete Best was a good drummer of a particular kind, but he was not, in their growing view, a good drummer of the kind they were now becoming. He had also remained slightly outside the social life of the band. He was the handsomest of them, and the local Liverpool fans, particularly the female ones, loved him. But he did not laugh at the same things the others laughed at. He did not adopt the haircut. He did not, in some way that none of them could quite have articulated at the time, fit. They knew by then who they wanted instead. There was a drummer in another Liverpool band, a fast-talking, easy-going, slightly older drummer named Richard Starkey, who played in Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. and who had drummed alongside them at the same Hamburg clubs, and who had filled in for Pete on a couple of occasions when Pete had been ill. He went on stage by Ringo Starr. They asked Brian to call him. Brian called him on the 14th of August. Ringo, who had been thinking of leaving the Hurricanes anyway, said yes, on the condition that he could give his current band a few days' notice. Brian agreed, and so on the morning of the 16th of August, 1962, Pete Best was driven into central Liverpool by the band's loyal driver and friend Neil Aspinall, who had become, in those years, romantically involved with Pete's mother Mona. Pete had no idea what the meeting was for. He sat down in Brian Epstein's office above the NEMS shop. Brian, by every account, looked uneasy and nervous. After some minutes of pleasantries, Brian said the words that he had been dreading saying. He said that the boys did not feel that Pete was the right drummer for them, and that George Martin had not been entirely happy with his playing either, and that they had decided to ask Ringo to take his place. Pete sat for a long moment, stunned, and then asked the only word that came to him, which was why. The reasons given then and afterward did not satisfy him. They never would. The handling of the firing was, by every later admission, badly done. John, Paul, and George had asked Brian to do the difficult thing, because they had not been able to face doing it themselves. Lennon, decades later, would say that they had been cowards. McCartney would say that he felt sorry for what Pete could have been onto. Harrison would say only that they could have handled it better. Pete went home. He did not sleep. He did not, for some weeks, leave his mother's house. The Liverpool fans, when they heard the news, were furious. There were chants of Pete forever, Ringo never outside the cavern. George Harrison received a black eye from a fan who thought he had been the one who had insisted on the change. Brian Epstein had to hire, briefly, a bodyguard. Pete Best went on, in the long decades that followed, to play in other bands, leave the music business altogether, work as a civil servant, and eventually, in the 1980s, return to performing under his own name. He has spoken in interviews about the firing. He has not, in any obvious way, forgiven it. Ringo Starr arrived for his first rehearsal on the 18th of August, played a Horticultural Society dance at Hume Hall in Birkenhead, and went the next week into the cavern as the band's new drummer. He had been born Richard Starkey on the 7th of July, 1940, in the Dingle, one of the rougher working-class neighbourhoods of Liverpool. He had been a sickly child, near death from peritonitis at 6, in the hospital for tuberculosis for 2 of his teenage years. He had picked up the drums during a long convalescence, more or less by accident on a tin tray. He had a deep, rough Liverpool voice that he hardly ever used to sing. He had a face that looked, even at 22, slightly older than the others. He brought to the band a steady, swinging, slightly behind-the-beat sense of timing that the others had not had, and that, once they had it, they would never give up. In the studio, on the 4th of September, 1962, the Beatles recorded their first single under George Martin's direction. The song was a Lennon-McCartney composition called Love Me Do. Martin, still uncertain about his new drummer, brought in a session drummer named Andy White for the second attempt at recording the song a week later, using Ringo on tambourine. The version with Ringo on drums and the version with Andy White on drums both exist on record. They are nearly identical to most listeners. But Ringo briefly thought he was about to be Pete Best Ed in his turn and was nervous for weeks afterward. He need not have been. By November of 1962, the fans had accepted him. By 1963, no one in Britain was thinking of him as anything but the Beatles' drummer. It would stay that way for the next 8 years. Chapter 4. Please Please Me and the year that followed. Love Me Do, when it was released on the 5th of October, 1962, did not, by the standards of what came after, do very much. It crept into the lower reaches of the British charts. It received a small amount of radio play. Brian Epstein bought, by some accounts, 10,000 copies himself to push it up the chart, although the truth of that has been debated. The record was a modest start. The next single, released in January of 1963, was something else. The song was called Please Please Me. John had written it originally as a slow, longing ballad in the manner of Roy Orbison, whom John admired enormously. George Martin, on hearing it in the studio, told them, in his polite parlophone way, that the song was not bad, but the tempo was wrong, and that it ought to be played faster and brighter and with more energy. John and Paul reworked it, raised the tempo, sharpened the harmonies. They recorded it in a single session in November of 1962. When they finished the take, George Martin pressed the talkback button from the control room and said the now famous line that, "Gentlemen, you have just made your first #1 record." He was right. Please Please Me reached the top of the British charts in February of 1963. EMI, on the strength of the success, asked them to record an album. The album was made more or less in a single working day. On the 11th of February, 1963, between 10 in the morning and 11 at night, with a break for lunch and tea, the Beatles entered Studio 2 at Abbey Road, set up their equipment, and recorded 10 of the 14 songs that would appear on the record. The other 4 had already been released as singles. They had played most of these songs hundreds of times in Hamburg and at the Cavern. They knew them in their bones. The album was, in essence, a recording of their live set. John was suffering that day from a heavy cold and his throat was raw. The last song they recorded, near 11 o'clock that night, was a cover of the Isley Brothers' Twist and Shout. Martin had asked them that morning to save it for the end, knowing that the screaming vocal would tear John's throat apart. They did one full take. Martin asked for another. John tried, but his voice was gone. The take they have is the take he had left in him. It is, by general agreement, one of the most thrillingly raw vocal performances in the history of recorded popular music. The album, called Please Please Me after the hit single, was released in March of 1963. Within weeks, it had reached #1 on the British album chart, where it remained, somewhat astonishingly, for 30 consecutive weeks until it was displaced, in November of that year, by its own follow-up. What was happening in Britain that spring, summer and autumn was a phenomenon that the press had begun, by the autumn, to call Beatlemania. The term seems to have been coined by a Scottish journalist after a riotous performance at the Glasgow Odeon. The newspapers picked it up. By the time the Beatles played a Royal Command performance at the Prince of Wales Theatre in London on the 4th of November, 1963, attended by the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret, the country was in the grip of something that could not be readily explained. John, on stage that night, made one of the most famous remarks of his life. He addressed the audience and asked the people in the cheaper seats to clap their hands, and then, after a perfectly judged pause, asked the rest of them to just rattle their jewelry. The line played as cheekiness. The Queen Mother smiled. The papers loved it. The second album, With the Beatles, was released at the end of November 1963, on the same Friday that, on the other side of the Atlantic, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The album, which had on its cover Robert Freeman's stark black and white photograph of the 4 faces in half shadow, was an immediate enormous hit. It contained the first George Harrison composition to be recorded by the band, a slightly stiff, slightly sad little song called Don't Bother Me, written when George was ill in a hotel bed during a tour. It was not a great song. It was a beginning. The American breakthrough came at the start of 1964. Capitol Records, the American arm of EMI, had been declining for nearly a year to release Beatles records in the United States on the grounds that British acts did not sell in America. Brian had been pushing. EMI eventually forced Capitol's hand. I Want to Hold Your Hand was released in America in late December 1963, and by the third week of January was the #1 single in the country. The Beatles, with Brian, flew to New York on the 7th of February 1964. They were met at what was now called John F. Kennedy International Airport, formerly Idlewild, by an estimated crowd of 3,000 screaming teenagers. They had not expected anyone. On the way into the city, in the back of a car, John asked a journalist whether someone famous had come in on the plane with them. 2 nights later, on the 9th of February 1964, they played 5 songs on The Ed Sullivan Show. An estimated 73 million Americans, more than a third of the country, watched. In living rooms across the United States, including a particular one on Meeting Lane in Hicksville, New York, where a 14-year-old named Billy Joel was sitting with his family, something turned in the popular imagination of that country that has not since turned back. American boys all over the continent put down their parents' Frank Sinatra records, picked up cheap guitars, and began to learn the chords. American girls all over the continent decided that the future, whatever it was going to be, was the future these 4 boys were going to lead them into. The pace of the next 2 years is hard, even now, to convey. They made a feature film. They made another album. They toured Britain, Europe, North America, Australia, the Far East. They made another film. They made another album. They appeared on television. They gave press conferences. They sat in cars in police-escorted convoys past screaming crowds. They stayed in hotels under siege. They saw mostly the inside of dressing rooms. The first film, A Hard Day's Night, was directed by an American expatriate named Richard Lester and released in the summer of 1964. It was, on the page, a thin premise. It was a fictionalized day in the life of the Beatles on tour with a few set pieces and a great many songs. What lifted it into something that has lasted as a piece of cinema as well as a piece of pop culture was Lester's nimble cinema verite direction, the speed and sharpness of the dialogue written for them by the Liverpool Welsh writer Alan Owen, who had spent time with the band on tour, and the specific gift each of the 4 of them turned out to have for being themselves, on camera, in the way the camera most rewards. The title was a Ringoism, an inadvertent malapropism Ringo had thrown out one tired night that John had instantly recognized as a song. The album of the same name was the first Beatles album to consist entirely of original Lennon-McCartney compositions, and is, song for song, one of their tightest and most consistent records. The second film, Help, came in the summer of 1965. It was a slighter affair than the first, a comic chase movie shot in the Bahamas and the Austrian Alps, in which the Beatles were pursued by a fictional Eastern cult who wanted Ringo's ring. The film is not the lasting one of the 2. The album that came with it included Ticket to Ride, with its early heavy backbeat from Ringo, and the song Help itself, a Lennon piece in the form of a fast, jangling pop song that, on closer listening, is a genuine cry from a man who is, although the public does not yet know it, not particularly happy. And it included Yesterday. Yesterday came to Paul, by his own account, in a dream. He woke up in the attic room of his then-girlfriend Jane Asher's family house in central London, where he was living, and went to the piano and played the melody he had heard in his sleep. He thought, for weeks afterward, that he must have heard it somewhere before, and asked everyone he knew if they recognized it. Nobody did. He filled in the lyrics, eventually. The song was recorded in June of 1965, with George Martin's suggestion of a small string quartet, rather than a full Beatles band performance. Paul sang it alone, with his acoustic guitar, accompanied only by the 4 classical players Martin had hired. None of the other 3 Beatles played on it. It became, in time, one of the most covered songs in the history of recorded music, with thousands of recordings by other artists. It is also, in the long view, the moment when one of the Beatles first stepped, however briefly, outside what had until then been the sound of a band. In June of 1965, the 4 of them were summoned to Buckingham Palace, where they were each appointed members of the Order of the British Empire by Queen Elizabeth II. The honour, given for services to British exports, infuriated certain decorated war veterans who returned their own MBAs in protest at being placed alongside what they saw as 4 scruffy Liverpool boys with a guitar habit. The Beatles thought the whole thing was very funny, although, having received the medals, they accepted them and went home and put them in drawers. In August of 1965, they played the largest concert that any rock band had, until then, ever played. The venue was Shea Stadium in the borough of Queens in New York City, the home of the New York Mets baseball team. 55,600 people attended. The amplification was inadequate to the room. The Beatles played for 30 minutes on a stage out at second base with 2 small Vox amplifiers and a public address system more suited to baseball announcements than rock music. They could not hear themselves. The audience could not hear them either. The screaming, by every account, drowned everything else out. Ringo, on the drum riser, kept time by watching John's shoulders. Paul shouted into a microphone he could not hear. John, by the end, was banging on the keyboard of an electric organ with his elbows and laughing helplessly, because the whole thing had become so absurd that there was nothing else to do. The Shea Stadium concert was the high water mark and the warning. The Beatles, who had been a working live band almost continuously since 1960, were beginning to discover in 1965 that the live act had become, in some way, beside the point. The audiences could no longer hear the music. The band could no longer play the new, more complex songs they were beginning to write, because they could not reproduce them on stage, and the personal toll of the touring, the constant police-escorted, hotel to airport to stadium rhythm, was beginning to grind. Something was going to have to change. By the end of 1965, in a different city, in a different studio, working on a different kind of record, they had begun, quietly, to change it. Chapter 5. Rubber Soul. There is no single moment at which the Beatles became the band we now think of when we hear the name. The change was gradual, and it had several authors. But if you were forced to name a record at which the change began to be audible to anyone listening carefully, that record would be Rubber Soul. It was made in the autumn of 1965 in something close to a hurry. The contract called for an album by Christmas. They had a few weeks. They went into Abbey Road in October. They came out at the start of November with the record finished. What they had in those weeks was not a great deal of time, but a great deal of new material, and a willingness to use the studio in ways they had not used it before. Norman Smith, who had been their engineer since the very first sessions, was in the process of moving up to producer in his own right, and was being replaced on the technical side by a quiet, painstaking young engineer named Jeff Emerick, who would, on the next record, become the technical mind that helped make the studio Beatles what they became. On Rubber Soul, however, the engineer was still mostly Norman, and the producer was still George Martin, and the four of them were still, even with the new material, in the room together as they had been since 1962. What had changed was outside the studio. They had been spending time with Bob Dylan. Dylan had met them in a New York hotel in August of 1964 and had introduced them to marijuana, which had transformed immediately the kind of conversations they had with one another and the kind of things they were able to write. They had been listening to the new wave of American records, the early birds, the Lovin' Spoonful, the work coming out of Brian Wilson's Beach Boys studio. They had been thinking about what an album, as opposed to a sequence of singles strung together, could be. They had been, more privately, beginning to grow up. John was, by then, in a marriage that had been, in effect, an accident. He had married a young art student named Cynthia Powell in August of 1962, when she had become pregnant with their son Julian. He had loved Cynthia in his way, but had not particularly wanted a wife and child at 21, and had been, in the years since, a difficult husband to her in ways he later acknowledged. He had a son he hardly saw. He lived in a large, mock Tudor house in the Surrey commuter belt, surrounded by possessions that meant little to him. He was, beneath the public Beatle, beginning to lose his footing. The first track on Rubber Soul, Drive My Car, was a Lennon-McCartney comedy with a sharp little riff. The second track was something else. It was called Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown, and it was John's attempt, in disguised form, to write about an affair he had been having outside the marriage. The arrangement, with George Harrison playing a sitar he had recently begun to study, was the first appearance of the instrument on a Western pop record. The lyric was elliptical and adult, and a little cruel, and unmistakably about something other than first love. There is, on the same record, a song called In My Life. John wrote it originally as a long lyric naming places in Liverpool he could remember, the streets and shops and bus stops of his childhood. He cut all of that out. What was left was a quieter, more universal song about people he had loved, places that had mattered, and about how, although those places were still there, the love that connected him to them was something different. The middle eight has a passage on what sounds like a harpsichord. It is not. It is George Martin playing a piano part at half speed, on a piano running at half tape speed, so that when the tape was played back at normal speed, the passage would sound in a higher, faster register. It was the kind of solution George Martin was good at. It was also a small instance of the studio beginning, in earnest, to become an instrument the Beatles played. There are other songs on Rubber Soul that mark the change. Nowhere Man is a song about a man who has lost the thread of his own life, written by John in 20 minutes one morning when he could not write anything else. Michelle by Paul is a half-French ballad in the style of a Parisian café song. Girl by John is a strange exhalation-driven song about a woman who is everything wrong for him and whom he cannot leave. Think for Yourself by George is a sour, inward-looking pop song with a fuzz bass played, unusually, by Paul, an early hint that George was beginning to write differently. If I Needed Someone, also by George, is a Byrds-influenced piece of jangle pop with 12-string guitar. The harmonies on the album, the close-stacked 3- and 4-part harmonies that had always been a Beatles trademark, were better than they had ever been. The songs were longer, the lyrics more thoughtful, the moods more adult, the textures more various. The cover by Robert Freeman was a stretched, slightly distorted photograph of the four faces taken from below, with the band's name in a soft yellow lettering placed across the top. There was no traditional Beatles logo. There was no scream of color. There was, instead, a quietness about the whole thing, a sense that this record was asking you to listen to it, rather than asking you to scream at it. Bob Dylan, on hearing Rubber Soul in late 1965, was reported to have been put on his guard. The Beatles, who had been the lovable bringers of joy on the Sullivan stage less than 2 years earlier, were now suddenly doing something he did not entirely know how to compete with. Brian Wilson, in California, on hearing Rubber Soul, decided that he would have to make a record that answered it. The record he made over the following year was called Pet Sounds. The Beatles, hearing Pet Sounds in turn, decided that they would have to answer it. The record they made the next summer was called Sgt. Pepper. Each of them, in those few years, was driving the others further than any of them would have gone alone. Rubber Soul was released on the 3rd of December, 1965. It went to number 1. It also did something quieter and more important. It signaled to the people who were paying attention, the other songwriters and producers and arrangers and engineers in the popular music business of that decade, that the Beatles had stopped being a teen sensation and had become something else, something whose end was not yet in sight. The boys who had screamed, twist and shout in the studio at the end of an exhausting day had, 3 years later, made an album that the next generation of serious pop music would build on. They had not stopped being a band that wrote love songs. They had simply, in the way slow change happens, started writing different ones. Chapter 6, Revolver and the End of the Touring Years. The record after Rubber Soul, made the following spring and summer, was the record on which the Beatles became, fully and unambiguously, a studio band. They were not yet ready in the spring of 1966 to admit it to themselves. They still had a tour to play. They still had the apparatus of Beatlemania around them. But what they made between April and June of 1966 in Studios 2 and 3 at Abbey Road was something the band on the stage at Shea Stadium could not, even if it had wanted to, reproduce in front of a live audience. The record was called Revolver. The technical mind on Revolver, in the engineer's chair, was a young man named Geoff Emerick, who was 19 years old when the sessions began. Norman Smith had been promoted to producer for other artists, which was how George Martin's preferred engineer, Emerick, had ended up at the desk on a Beatles record. Emerick was, by his own later account, slightly terrified at the prospect. The Beatles, by that spring, were not interested in technical convention. They wanted things to sound new. They wanted, in Emmerick's later words, instruments to sound unlike themselves. He had been trained at EMI in the cautious house style of orderly mic placement and gentle compression. Within a few weeks of the Revolver sessions starting, he was breaking nearly every rule he'd been taught. The first song they recorded for the album was the song that would, in the end, close it. It was called, at the time of recording, simply Mark I, and it would eventually be called Tomorrow Never Knows, after a phrase Ringo had thrown out in a press conference and that John had liked. John had written it after reading a book by Timothy Leary called The Psychedelic Experience, which was an adaptation for the LSD generation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. He had begun by that point to take LSD with some regularity. He wanted the song to sound like the chanting of Tibetan monks on a mountaintop, with his vocal sounding as if it were the voice of the Dalai Lama heard from a great distance. He told George Martin this, and Martin, who was used to having to interpret rather extreme requests, asked Emerick to find a solution. Emmerick's solution, after some thought, was to feed John's vocal through a Leslie speaker. The rotating speaker cabinet usually used with a Hammond organ, which produced a swirling, slightly otherworldly, slightly disembodied effect that John, when he heard it, loved. The rhythm track on the song was, by Beatles standards, simple. A heavy, hypnotic, thudding pattern from Ringo, with the snare and the bass drum mic'd extremely closely and compressed into a sound none of them had ever heard before. A sustained C drone on McCartney's bass and Harrison's tambura. No chord changes in the traditional sense for the entire song. Onto this John laid the vocal, and onto this all four of the Beatles, working from home tape recorders in the weeks before the session, laid a series of short tape loops they had each made on their own. McCartney's loops were the most prepared. He had been listening, in his off hours, to the German avant-garde composer Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, and had been making, on his Brennell home tape recorder, a series of short loops of distorted guitar, sped-up laughter, sustained chords, the rim of a wine glass being rubbed. He brought them in a plastic bag. What followed was one of the most famous afternoons in the history of the recording studio. Emmerich took 5 of the loops and threaded them, each on a separate tape machine in a different studio in the Abbey Road building, with a pencil placed inside each loop to keep the tension. Engineers in each studio held the pencils. The signals were fed back to the mixing console in Studio 3, where the 4 Beatles, with George Martin and Emmerich, manipulated the faders, fading each loop in and out as the song played. They did this live to the master tape in a single performance. The mix that survives is the mix from one such pass. Martin would later say that the result could never be exactly reproduced, because the spontaneity of the fader work would never quite repeat itself the same way twice. The song, when it was finished, was not like anything that had appeared on a popular record before. It was the moment when the studio became, on a Beatles record, an instrument they were playing. Tomorrow Never Knows is the closing track on Revolver. The opening track on most of the world's pressings of the record is George Harrison's Taxman, a sour, biting little song about the British government's punitive top tax rates of the period, with a guitar solo by Paul that is one of the most aggressive sounds on any Beatles record. The placing of a Harrison composition first on the album was not a small gesture. George had been writing more and writing better with each record. He would have 3 songs on Revolver, more than on any previous album. Taxman was the first of them. Love You Too, his second, was the most fully Indian-influenced piece any pop band had yet released, with sitar, tabla and tambura playing a song in a recognizably Indian raga structure. I Want to Tell You, his third, was a fast, jagged little pop song with a deliberately unresolved piano figure pressed into the chorus. Paul's contributions to Revolver were among the strongest he had so far written. Eleanor Rigby, the second track on the album, was a McCartney song about loneliness, told in the third person, set to an arrangement by George Martin of a string octet, 4 violins, 2 violas, 2 cellos. There were no Beatles instruments on the song. It was Paul's voice, with backing harmonies from John and George, and the 8 string players in a tight, close-mic'd configuration. Emmerich, against the strict EMI rules, placed the microphone so close to the players that the bows were almost touching them, producing a hard, dry, almost rasping string sound that gave the song its peculiar urgency. The lyric ended on the line about all the lonely people. Where do they all belong? The song was released as a double A-side single with Yellow Submarine, the Ringo-sung children's tune, also on the album, and reached number 1. Here, There and Everywhere is among the gentlest things Paul ever wrote. Got to Get You Into My Life is a brassy, soul-influenced number with horns, which Paul later admitted was, in part, a love song to marijuana. Good Day Sunshine is a sunny vaudeville pastiche. For No One is one of the loveliest of the McCartney character sketches, a precise, painful little portrait of the moment a relationship ends, with a French horn solo played by Alan Civil that is one of the most beautiful single instrumental passages on any Beatles record. John's other contributions, beyond Tomorrow Never Knows, included I'm Only Sleeping, with George's reverse guitar solo, recorded in pieces and then flipped backwards on tape so that it played from end to beginning. There was And Your Bird Can Sing, a fast, sharp piece of pop. There was She Said, a paranoid LSD piece written after an afternoon Lennon had spent with the actor Peter Fonda in Los Angeles. The album was, by any reckoning, the most musically various and inventive record any pop band had then made. It was released in August of 1966. By the time it appeared, the band was in the middle of what would turn out to be its last tour. They had been touring, more or less continuously, since 1963. The summer of 1966 was the moment at which the touring stopped working. There were, that summer, two specific incidents in addition to the more general grinding fatigue. The first happened in the Philippines in early July. The Beatles had been invited, while on tour in Manila, to a luncheon at the Presidential Palace hosted by Imelda Marcos, the wife of the country's president. The invitation had been mishandled by their tour management. The Beatles, by that point, had a strict rule against attending official functions, which had been worked out in earlier travels. Brian Epstein declined the invitation on their behalf. Imelda Marcos, who had assembled 300 children expecting to meet them, was publicly humiliated. The Manila press denounced the band. The band's police protection was withdrawn. They were jostled and kicked and spat on in the airport on their way out of the country, and were lucky to leave with their lives. They flew to Delhi, which was the first place George had been to India, a trip that would matter later, and then home to England. The second incident, by far the more famous of the two, came at the end of the same month. An English journalist named Maureen Cleave had, several months earlier, conducted a long, thoughtful interview with John for the London Evening Standard, in which John, in the course of a wide-ranging conversation, had observed that Christianity was in decline in modern Britain, and that the Beatles, in some respects, were now more popular than Jesus. The remark, in its original context, was a sociological observation, not a claim of equivalence. In Britain, where the interview had appeared in March, no one had paid it much attention. In late July, an American teen magazine called Datebook reprinted the interview with the popular Than Jesus line on its cover. The American Bible Belt erupted. Radio stations in the South announced bonfires of Beatles records. Death threats began to arrive. The Ku Klux Klan threatened protests. The American tour, scheduled to begin in mid-August, was suddenly an open question. John, on arrival in Chicago, gave a press conference at which he attempted, half successfully, to apologize for the misunderstanding, while declining to say that he had been wrong. The tour went ahead, but in an atmosphere of permanent threat. They played 23,000 miles of stadium dates, in which the playing was nearly always inaudible against the screaming, and the noise was not always benign. The final show of that tour, on the 29th of August, 1966, was at Candlestick Park in San Francisco, the home of the San Francisco Giants. 30,000 seats were sold. The set lasted 33 minutes. They walked off the stage, climbed into a van, were driven to the airport, and flew to Los Angeles. None of them said it on the plane, but all four of them separately had decided the touring was over. In the months that followed, they retreated. John acted in a Richard Lester film called How I Won the War, shot in Spain, and grew the round wire-rimmed glasses that would become, almost immediately, his most identifiable feature. George went to India to study sitar, more seriously now, with the master Ravi Shankar. Paul stayed in London, going to art galleries and concerts, working with the avant-garde, taking, at some point in the autumn, his first dose of LSD, a drug the other three had been taking for some time. Ringo spent time at home with his wife and son. In November, John attended an evening preview at a small avant-garde art gallery in central London called Indica. The exhibit was by a Japanese artist he had not heard of named Yoko Ono. Among the pieces in the show was a small white step-ladder. At the top of the ladder, a magnifying glass hung on a chain. A canvas was mounted on the ceiling above it, with a single tiny word written in pencil on the canvas. The visitor was meant to climb the ladder, look through the magnifying glass, and read the word. John climbed the ladder and looked. The word was yes. He climbed back down. He thought, looking around at this strange, deadpan, unsmiling Japanese artist, who was older than he was and seemed to have made an entire art practice out of small acts of attention, that there was something here he wanted to know more about. He took her phone number. It would, in time, change everything. Chapter 7. Sergeant Pepper. They came back into Abbey Road in November of 1966, with no tour ahead of them, no schedule pressing on them, and the studio entirely at their disposal. They had been told by EMI that they could stay in the building as long as they wanted, work whatever hours they pleased, and use whatever resources they needed. They had become, by that point, the most commercially valuable artists in the company's history. The freedom they had earned, and that they used over the 7 months that followed, would produce one of the most discussed and most influential records in the history of popular music. The first 2 songs they recorded in the new sessions were a Lennon song and a McCartney song, both about Liverpool. John's was called Strawberry Fields Forever, after a Salvation Army children's home near Mendibs, where he had played as a boy in the gardens behind the wall. Paul's was called Penny Lane, after a roundabout in the Mossley Hill area where he and John had often met. Both were extraordinary. John's was a slow, dreamy, deeply unsettled meditation on memory and confusion and the difficulty of being inside one's own mind, with mellotron, dropping pitch, swirling effects, and a vocal that sounded as if it were being dragged out of him from underwater. Paul's was a bright, brass-driven, almost cinematic walk down a single street, with a piccolo trumpet solo by the classical player David Mason, that Paul, having seen Mason play a Bach piece on television one evening, had specifically requested. George Martin, looking at what they had, urged the band to make these the first 2 songs of a new themed album about their childhoods, an autobiographical Liverpool record. EMI, however, was demanding a single immediately. There had been no new Beatles single for many months. Brian Epstein, against George Martin's strong advice, took both songs off the album and released them, in February of 1967, as a double A-side single. It was, Martin would later say, the worst professional mistake of his career. The album had been deprived of its 2 strongest tracks. The single, despite being one of the strongest pop records ever made, was oddly blocked from the top spot in the British charts by a quiet ballad called Release Me by Engelbert Humperdinck. John would joke about it for years. The Beatles, who had been knocking themselves off the #1 spot for 3 years, had finally been beaten by an easy-listening record. Paul, who had been pushing the autobiographical concept, now needed a different one. He came up with the idea, on a flight back from Kenya, of an album by a fictional band, an Edwardian military-style band called Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, with the Beatles in costume on the cover playing the part. The conceit gave them, in his thinking, a kind of permission. They would not have to be the Beatles on this record. They could be someone else. It would, in his words, free them. The sessions ran from December 1966 through April 1967. The studio became, in the band's words, their clubhouse. They installed psychedelic lighting. They wore caftans and printed shirts. They invited friends. Mick Jagger, Donovan, members of the Rolling Stones, the Hollies, the Monkees, all came through Abbey Road during the sessions to listen and watch. Drug use was, by that point, woven through everything. Marijuana was constant. LSD was frequent, although not in the studio itself. McCartney, having held off LSD longer than the others, had now taken it, and was, by his own account, in a creative period of remarkable openness. The technical innovations of Sgt. Pepper were many. Geoff Emerick, by then more confident in his role, was given the freedom to do almost anything he could imagine. The drums were given a new sound, with the bass drum heavily mic'd, packed with a sweater, and treated with limiter compression, in violation of EMI policy. Vocals were double-tracked using a new technique called artificial double tracking, ADT, invented by an EMI technician named Ken Townsend, which allowed a vocalist to instantly double his own voice without singing the part twice. EMI's 4-track machines, in the absence of the 8-track machines that would not arrive in the building until later in 1967, were pushed to the absolute limit of their capacity through reduction mixing. The technique of bouncing several finished tracks down to a single track on a fresh tape, so that the freed-up tracks could be used for further overdubs. By the end of the sessions, certain mixes contained, when you traced them back through the layers of reduction, the equivalent of dozens of original tracks. The songs themselves were a vast variety. With a little help from my friends was Ringo's vocal turn, a friendly little song written for him by John and Paul. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was a Lennon song with imagery his son, Julian, had given him, and which the BBC, when it heard the song, banned for what it took to be coded references to LSD. Getting Better was a small Paul song with a sour, dry, deadpan John line. Fixing a Hole was Paul. She's Leaving Home was Paul again, a McCartney character sketch in Waltz Time about a daughter running away from home, scored for harp and strings with no Beatles instruments at all. Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite was John's song, with lyrics adapted directly from a Victorian circus poster he had found in an antique shop. The arrangement, with steam organ samples that George Martin spliced together from random fragments, cut up and reassembled at random, gave the song its strange, drifting carnival quality. Within You Without You was George's song, written and recorded entirely with Indian musicians, on sitar, dilruba, tabla and tambura, with a string section added by George Martin. It was the first Beatles song with no Beatles other than its writer playing on it. The lyrics were the most explicitly philosophical and Indian-influenced thing the band had yet released. George had been, in those months, deep in his study of Hindu thought. The song stood and still stands as the moment at which George Harrison stopped being merely the third Beatle and started being a serious composer of his own. When I'm 64 was a Paul song that he had written when he was 15 years old, in the style of his father's dance band repertoire. Lovely Rita was a piece of light pop. Good Morning was John's song, which used the sound of a Kellogg's Cornflakes television advertisement as part of its melody, and which ended with an extended sequence of farmyard animal sounds, sequenced by Emerick so that each successive animal could, theoretically, eat the one before. The reprise of the title track followed, and then, with no separation, the song that closed the record. A Day in the Life was, by general agreement, the masterpiece of the record. John had begun it, sitting at home with the Daily Mail propped up on his piano, finding inspiration in the small newspaper items of an ordinary morning. There was a story about the death of a friend of the band's, the Guinness heir Tara Brown, in a car accident in central London. There was a story about 4,000 potholes in the streets of the town of Blackburn, Lancashire. There was a small advertisement for the film John had been making in Spain, How I Won the War. He took these fragments, set them to a slow, descending piano figure, and built 2 verses around them. Paul, who had a separate fragment about an ordinary morning, getting out of bed, dragging a comb across his head, falling into a daydream on the bus, contributed a middle section. The 2 pieces, joined together, made the song's structure. What they did not have, between them, was a way to get from one section to the other, or a way to end. The solution arrived through a series of conversations and a great deal of trial and error. Lennon wanted, in the empty 24 bars between the verse and the middle section, something that started small and built up to, in his words, the end of the world. McCartney suggested an orchestra. George Martin pointed out that EMI was unlikely to pay for a full orchestra to record what amounted to about a minute of music. Ringo, in the kind of practical aside he occasionally produced, suggested they hire half an orchestra and have them play it twice. So that is what they did. On the 10th of February, 1967, in Studio 1 at Abbey Road, the largest of the EMI studios, 40 classically trained musicians from London's Symphony Pool gathered for an evening session. The Beatles had asked them in advance to wear formal evening dress. They had then, when the players arrived, handed each of them a piece of costume to put on top of the formal dress. The lead violinist wore a gorilla paw. A bassoonist had a balloon stuck to the end of his instrument. There were fake noses. There were paper hats. The Beatles' friends were there. Mick Jagger was there. Marianne Faithfull was there. Donovan, Keith Richards, Michael Nesmith of the Monkees, the design collective The Fool, Patty Harrison. Champagne was poured. Sparklers were lit. The night was, in Beatles' publicist tradition, what would later be called a happening. George Martin had written, for the orchestral passage, an unusual score. Each player was instructed to begin, on a given downbeat, on the lowest note their instrument could comfortably play, and to climb, over 24 bars, to the highest. The path between was up to them. The result, when it was recorded, was a slow, atonal, swelling crescendo that did not sound like any orchestra they had ever heard. The 40 players were recorded, then re-recorded, then re-recorded again, 4 times in all, on 4 separate tracks of a parallel 4-track tape running in synchronization with the band's master, courtesy of an electronic linkage Ken Townsend had improvised on the spot. The effect was the equivalent of 160 musicians playing the same crescendo at once. What ended the song after the second crescendo was an enormous chord, played on 3 pianos at once by John, Paul and Ringo, with a 4th piano part overdubbed by John and the road manager Mal Evans, with George Martin on a harmonium playing a sustained note alongside it, all hammered down at the same instant on the count of 3. The faders on the mixing console were then opened slowly all the way up over the next 40 seconds, as the chord decayed, so that by the end of the recording you could hear, in the ambient hum, the sound of the studio's own air conditioning. The chord rang for 43 seconds before it faded into silence. They had ended the album with a sound that, when it was over, made you, as a listener, conscious of the room in which you were sitting. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was released on the 1st of June, 1967. The cover, designed by the artists Peter Blake and Jan Howarth, was a collage assembled with cardboard cutouts in a flower bed of the faces of the Beatles' chosen heroes, from Edgar Allan Poe to Marilyn Monroe to Bob Dylan to Karl Marx to Stuart Sutcliffe. The record was released without singles, intended to be heard as a whole. It changed, more or less immediately, what an album could be. The reviews were rapturous. The cultural moment, which had become known by then as the Summer of Love, accepted it as its anthem. The world briefly agreed about something. The four young men from Liverpool who had walked off the Candlestick Park stage 9 months earlier had, in the studio, made the record they could never have made on tour. They were no longer a band that played for screaming teenagers. They were something else. What they were going to do next was, even to them, not yet entirely clear. Chapter 8. The Death of Brian and the Trip to India. On the 25th of August, 1967, at the height of the Sgt. Pepper summer, the Beatles, with their wives and partners and various entourage, travelled to Bangor in North Wales to attend a weekend seminar on transcendental meditation given by the Indian guru Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. George Harrison's wife Patty had become, that spring, interested in meditation and had brought her husband along. George had brought the others. They went up to Bangor on a Friday by train. They were photographed sitting cross-legged on the carpets of their compartment, looking, in their flowered shirts, like the picture of the new 60s they had become. On the Saturday, they attended the Maharishi's lectures. On the Sunday morning, the 27th of August, a phone call came through to the Maharishi's compound. Brian Epstein had been found dead in the bedroom of his house in Belgravia, London, by his housekeeper. He had been alone for the long bank holiday weekend after a planned house party at his country place had not come together as he had hoped. He had taken, on returning to London, a quantity of the prescription sedative Carbitral on top of the alcohol he had drunk earlier in the evening. The coroner's verdict was accidental overdose. He was 32 years old. The Beatles received the news at the Maharishi's compound. They came down the steps of the building in a daze to face the press and gave a short, shocked statement to the cameras. They had loved Brian. He had, more than any single person, made the world they now lived in possible. He had been the one who made the calls. He had been the one who fought their battles with the labels and the venues and the press. Without him, they did not suddenly know who was supposed to do what. Lennon, asked years later what the death of Brian had meant for the band, answered with bleak directness. "We were finished," he said. He did not mean immediately. He meant that the line from the death of Brian to the breakup of the band 3 years later was a line you could draw. What they did in the weeks that followed was throw themselves into a project Paul had been pushing for some months. He had had the idea, while flying back from a trip in the spring, of a long, unscripted, freewheeling television film modelled on the strange American freedom of Ken Kesey's Merry Pranksters, in which the Beatles and a cast of friends would board a brightly painted bus, drive around the English countryside, and have small, magical, only loosely connected adventures. The film would be shot, songs would be written and recorded for it. It would be sold to the BBC for Christmas broadcast. It would, Paul felt, give the band something to throw itself at after the loss of Brian, before the slower question of what to do next had to be faced. The other three, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, agreed. Magical Mystery Tour, the film, was shot over 2 weeks in September 1967 on a hired bus driven through Devon and Cornwall, with a cast of professional actors, comedians, and various Beatles associates. There was no real script. There was, in McCartney's later admission, no real plan. There was a great deal of charm and a great deal of confusion. The film was assembled, more or less, in the editing room afterward. The accompanying songs, recorded at Abbey Road in the autumn, included Paul's gentle "The Fool on the Hill," John's "I Am the Walrus," with its surreal layered nonsense lyrics and its deliberate orchestration of overheard radio voices speaking King Lear, and George's Blue Jay Way, written one foggy night in Los Angeles when he was waiting for a friend named Derek Taylor to arrive at his rented house. The songs, taken on their own, were strong. The film, when it was broadcast on BBC One on Boxing Day 1967, was not. The reviews were savage. The Daily Express called it boring. The Daily Mail called it appalling. It was the first thing the Beatles had ever produced that the country had not loved. It would not be the last. The records, however, kept selling. The double EP soundtrack of Magical Mystery Tour expanded in the United States into a full-length LP that included also Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane, and the great singles of 1967, Hello Goodbye, the title track, All You Need Is Love, became an enormous commercial success. All You Need Is Love had been performed live in June of 1967 on the world's first global satellite television broadcast called Our World, beamed to an estimated audience of 400 million people in 25 countries. The Beatles had been chosen as Britain's contribution. They had written the song specifically for the broadcast with a deliberately simple message in language any global audience would understand. They had performed it from Studio One at Abbey Road in caftans, surrounded by friends holding flowers. It was, in retrospect, the high watermark of the cultural moment they had come to embody. In February of 1968, having postponed the trip several times, they finally left for India to study transcendental meditation properly with the Maharishi at his ashram in Rishikesh, in the Himalayan foothills above the Ganges. They went with their wives and girlfriends and a small entourage, including Mia Farrow, the Beach Boys' Mike Love, the singer Donovan, and others. They lived for some weeks in spare stone cabins on the ashram grounds. They woke at dawn. They meditated for many hours a day. They ate vegetarian food. They walked in the gardens. They composed. What came out of Rishikesh, in songwriting terms, was the largest single creative outpouring of the Beatles' career. Each of the four of them, in those weeks of quiet, wrote prolifically. By the time they came home, they had something like 40 new songs in various states of completion. Most of those songs would, later that year, find their way onto the next album. A handful would be saved for later records. A few even would still be unreleased decades later. They left India, however, not all at once, and not on entirely happy terms. Ringo and his wife Maureen left first, after about 10 days, having found the food and the climate intolerable. Paul left after about a month, anxious to get back to Apple. John and George stayed the longest. In April, however, an allegation arose, raised by a member of the entourage, that the Maharishi had behaved improperly with one of the women on the retreat. The allegation, it has been argued ever since, was almost certainly unfounded. But John, who had a temperamental tendency to believe the worst of people once he had decided to, took it as final. He confronted the Maharishi. The Maharishi asked him why he was leaving. Lennon, in one of the more famous parting shots of his life, said that if the Maharishi was so cosmic, he would know. They left for the airport that day. On the long ride down the mountain, John began drafting a song called Sexy Sadie, originally titled Maharishi, the lyrics of which were a barely disguised attack on the man they were leaving. What they had brought back with them, beyond the songs, was a complicated set of new realities. They were no longer the band Brian had managed. They were no longer the band that lived inside the bubble he had built around them. They were each individually in possession of a great deal of money, a great deal of time, and a great many ideas about what to do next. Apple Corps, the company they had founded, was beginning that spring to lose money on a scale that would, within a year, become catastrophic. John had begun that spring to make telephone calls to Yoko Ono. Their world, the four of them, was about to splinter into something else. The next record they made would be the sound of the splintering. Chapter 9. The White Album. They came home from India in the spring of 1968 with the songs that would become their next record. The record, when it was released that November, would carry no descriptive title at all. The cover, designed by the British pop artist Richard Hamilton, would be plain white, with the words "The Beatles" embossed faintly in the lower right corner. The world has called it, ever since, the White Album. It was made between May and October of 1968 in long, fractious, irregular sessions at Abbey Road and at the smaller Trident Studios on St Anne's Court in Soho. It was recorded as a double album, 4 sides of vinyl, 30 songs. George Martin, in retrospect, thought they would have made a much better single album with judicious editing, and has said so. The Beatles by then were not in the mood for editing. They were in the mood for putting on the record everything they had brought back from India, and a few things they had written since. Each of them was, in his own way, beginning to operate as a separate songwriter, rather than as part of a collective. Many of the tracks were recorded with only 1 or 2 of the 4 playing on them, with sidemen filling in for whoever was not in the room. The togetherness that had defined the earlier records was, song by song, falling away. The atmosphere was difficult. John had, by the start of the sessions, separated from his wife Cynthia and was attending sessions with Yoko Ono, who sat with him in the studio at all hours, made suggestions, joined in the recording, and was, in the band's general view, an intruder on a process they had jealously guarded as their own. Paul, who had been the keenest of them on Apple and the keenest of them on keeping the group functioning as a working unit, was doing more and more of the executive work, and was, in turn, being resented for it by John and George, who experienced his organizational energy as bossiness. George, who had returned from India having written some of the strongest songs of his life, was finding once again that John and Paul did not always treat his songs with the seriousness he felt they deserved. Ringo, the most equable of them, simply walked out one afternoon in August, said he was no longer needed, and went off to Sardinia for 2 weeks on a friend's yacht. The other 3 sent him a telegram begging him to come back. He did. There were flowers all over his drum kit when he returned. Jeff Emmerich, the engineer who had become so central to the sound of Revolver and Sgt. Pepper, gave up halfway through the sessions and asked to be reassigned. He had simply, he said in his memoir, Here, There and Everywhere, found the sessions too unhappy to continue. A new young engineer named Ken Scott took over. What came out of all of this, however, was a record of remarkable variety and, in places, remarkable depth. There was Paul's Blackbird, a finger-picked acoustic guitar piece written in support, he said, of the American civil rights movement of the moment. There was John's Julia, a delicate solo Lennon piece for his late mother, and, by way of the line about Ocean Child, also for Yoko, whose first name in Japanese means Ocean Child. There was George's While My Guitar, Gently Weeps, on which Eric Clapton, an old friend of George's, was invited to play the lead guitar solo, partly because the others had been dismissive of the song until a non-Beatle was in the room playing it. There was Paul's Helter Skelter, written deliberately to be the loudest, hardest thing any band had recorded, with Ringo's drumming so violent that he later complained of blisters on his fingers. There was John's Happiness is a Warm Gun, a multi-section song with an opening of acoustic guitar and a closing of doo-wop harmonies. There was Paul's Back in the USSR, a Beach Boys parody. There was the strange fragmentary tape collage Revolution 9, which was John's experimental piece, 8 minutes of layered tape loops and spoken words, the kind of thing he had been making at home with Yoko on his own equipment. McCartney and Harrison both argued against its inclusion. Lennon insisted. The record was bracketed beautifully by 2 contrasting Lennon love songs. Dear Prudence, on the first side, was written for Mia Farrow's sister, Prudence Farrow, who had been at the Rishikesh ashram and had locked herself in her cabin to meditate so intensely that Lennon and Harrison had been asked to coax her out. The song is gentle, clean, tender. Good Night, on the last side, was written by John as a lullaby for his son Julian, sung by Ringo with a sweeping George Martin orchestral arrangement that was deliberately the lushest, most old-fashioned thing on the entire record. The album, opening with the engine roar of an aircraft and closing with a child being told to sleep, contained, between those 2 sounds, every kind of music the 4 of them could think of. In August of 1968, between sessions, they had released the single Hey Jude, the longest song they had ever released, a 7-minute Paul ballad written initially as a song of comfort for John's son Julian during his parents' separation. The song was an immediate, enormous hit, the most commercially successful single they ever released. The B-side, John's Revolution, was the closest he had yet come in song form to a political statement. The 2 sides of the record stood, in a way, for the 2 halves of the band the Beatles were now becoming. The warm Paul side and the sharper, more agitated John side. The White Album, when it was released on the 22nd of November 1968, was a critical and commercial success. It also was, although they did not yet quite know it, the moment at which the band stopped, except in name, being a band. Chapter 10, Get Back and the Rooftop. The first idea in the new year of 1969 was to go back to where they had come from. Paul, in particular, felt that the band had lost its bearings during the studio extravagances of the previous 2 years, and that what was needed was a return to the live performance discipline that had made them in the first place. They would write a new album of straight-ahead rock and roll songs. They would rehearse them as a live band. They would film the rehearsals and the eventual performance for a television documentary. The performance itself would, in the most ambitious version of the plan, be an actual live concert, perhaps in a Roman amphitheatre in Tunisia, perhaps on an ocean liner, perhaps on a London rooftop. The album would be called Get Back, and the film of the same name would be its companion. They would, in effect, perform the act of becoming the Beatles again on camera. It didn't work out as planned. The rehearsals began on the 2nd of January 1969 at Twickenham Film Studios, a cavernous, cold, badly lit soundstage on the western edge of London. Filming began at 8 in the morning. The band had not been required to keep early hours since 1962. They were not, by temperament, a morning band. They sat around in coats. They tried to remember the songs they had been working on. They argued about arrangements. They argued about whether anyone had made the tea. The tensions that had been simmering through the White Album sessions came back faster in the bright camera light. On the 10th of January, after a particularly difficult rehearsal during which Paul had once again lectured the others in his organizational voice about how the songs ought to be played, George Harrison quietly said that he was leaving. He went home. He was gone for 5 days. The others, after a long internal meeting at which various solutions were proposed and discarded, agreed to 2 of George's conditions. They would abandon Twickenham and move to the new Apple recording studios in the basement of the Apple building on Savile Row, and they would forget the idea of any concert or filmed performance. He came back. They moved. A great deal of the unhappiness of the early sessions has, in the years since, been recovered and reframed by the Peter Jackson documentary, The Beatles, Get Back, released in 2021, which assembled from the original Twickenham and Apple footage 60 hours of material into an 8-hour film. What had been remembered for 50 years as a uniformly miserable period turned out, on the actual footage, to contain a great many moments of laughter, easy collaboration, and visible affection between the four men. The arguments were real. So was the friendship. Both can be true at once. By the end of January, in the basement at Savile Row, with the addition of a young American keyboard player named Billy Preston, whom George had invited to sit in, the band had pulled itself together. They had Get Back, the title song, which had grown out of an in-studio jam. They had Don't Let Me Down, John's intense, plain love song to Yoko. They had Two of Us, Paul's gentle song, ostensibly for Linda Eastman, the photographer who had become his partner and whom he would marry in March, but read by some as a kind of sideways farewell to John. They had Let It Be, Paul's slow, hymn-like piece that he had written after a dream of his late mother Mary, appearing to him with the words, Let It Be. They had The Long and Winding Road, another Paul ballad. They had I Me Mine, George's small, sour Vienna waltz of a song about ego. They needed, however, an ending. The idea of a televised concert had been abandoned, but the film still needed a climactic performance. A solution was proposed by various accounts, either Paul or the American director of photography on the project. They would simply walk up the stairs of the Apple building, set up their equipment on the flat roof, and play. On the cold, grey, blustery afternoon of the 30th of January 1969, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr and Billy Preston, with their guitars, John's overcoat over Yoko's fur jacket, ran a cable up from the basement and played, on the rooftop of 3 Savile Row, what would turn out to be the last public concert any of them ever gave together as the Beatles. They played for 42 minutes. They played 5 songs, with multiple takes of some, ending with Get Back. Office workers in the streets below stopped and looked up. Some of them climbed onto neighboring rooftops to watch. Within a few minutes, the police had arrived, summoned by complaints from a nearby bank manager about the noise. The police climbed up to the roof and were filmed gently, asking the band to stop. The band finished the song they were in the middle of. John, at the end, stepped to the microphone and said the line that would be remembered. He said that he hoped they had passed the audition. The cameras kept rolling. The roof emptied. The performance, although none of them said it at the time, had been a goodbye. What followed the rooftop was almost a year of unresolved confusion. The Get Back tapes, hours and hours of material, were given to various producers in turn, and rejected, and given to others, and rejected again, until, by the spring of 1970, they would end up in the hands of the American producer Phil Spector, who would overlay strings and choirs onto The Long and Winding Road in a manner that would so infuriate McCartney that it became, in his eventual lawsuit, one of his named grievances. The album would eventually be released in May 1970, retitled Let It Be. The film, edited from the documentary footage, would be released the same month. It was widely understood, by the time the album and film appeared, to be the document of a band falling apart. But there was, in fact, one more record left. They were not yet ready to admit the band was over. They went back into Abbey Road in the summer of 1969, with George Martin having asked him to produce a record the way they had used to make records, with discipline, with care, with attention. He agreed, on the condition that they let him produce. They agreed. The record they made, between July and August of 1969, would be their last and one of their finest. Chapter 11. Abbey Road. Abbey Road was made between the 2nd of July and the 20th of August, 1969, in roughly 7 weeks of focused work, by 4 men who knew, at some level beneath words, that this was probably the last thing they were going to do together. The atmosphere, by every later account, was professional, calm, even warm. They had, after the Get Back debacle, agreed to do this one properly. George Martin was back at the helm. Jeff Emerick, whom they had asked to come back specifically for the record, was at the desk. The studio had, by then, finally received an 8-track tape machine, which gave them, on this album for the first time, the kind of multi-track capacity that the elaborate Sgt. Pepper had been built without. The record opens with a hard, surging Lennon song called Come Together, written originally as a campaign song for Timothy Leary's run for the governorship of California, transformed in the studio into something stranger and looser. It moves into George Harrison's Something, the most beautiful love song George had yet written, addressed, although he later denied it, to his wife Patty. The song was covered within a few years by hundreds of artists, most notably by Frank Sinatra, who would, for the rest of his career, describe it as the greatest love song of the past 50 years. The fact that it was a Harrison song and not a Lennon-McCartney song was, by 1969, no longer surprising. George had, on this record, 2 songs, both first-rate. The other was Here Comes the Sun, written one morning at Eric Clapton's house in Surrey, where he'd gone to get away from a particularly unhappy day of Apple business meetings. The song, with its bright, finger-picked acoustic figure and its hopeful lyric, was, by general agreement, one of the simplest and most affecting things on the record. The first side of the record, After Something and the Ringo song Octopus's Garden, contained the Lennon piece Maxwell's Silver Hammer, a deliberately childlike, deliberately violent piece of music hall pastiche that John in particular came to detest, and that Paul kept insisting on through take after take until everyone in the studio was tired of it. It contained Oh Darling, Paul's Little Richard pastiche, on which he came in early to the studio for several days running to record his vocal in a state of fresh exhaustion in order to get the right strained quality. It contained the long, dark Lennon piece I Want You, She's So Heavy, which closed the first side with 3 minutes of building noise, and then a sudden, abrupt cut to silence, engineered by Lennon himself with a razor blade and a piece of tape. The second side of the record was the medley. Paul had been, for some weeks, collecting song fragments that none of them had quite finished, and arguing for assembling them into a single sustained sequence. John had been less interested. George Martin, who had wanted for years to do something more symphonic than a typical pop record, had been delighted. The medley, when it was assembled, ran for 16 minutes, weaving together 8 song fragments, mostly Paul's, with 2 of John's, into a continuous sequence. It moved from You Never Give Me Your Money, through Sun King, into Mean Mr. Mustard and Polythene Pam, and She Came In, through the bathroom window, through Golden Slumbers and Carry That Weight, into the final movement, called simply The End. The end contained, near its close, a brief drum solo by Ringo, the only drum solo on any Beatles record. It was followed by 3 short guitar solos, 2 bars each, traded back and forth between Paul, George, and John. In that order, the only time the 3 of them played lead together on a record. And it ended with one of the most perfectly judged closing couplets in the history of pop music. The line said that in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. After the end, after a few seconds of silence, came 23 seconds of a small, half-finished Paul song called Her Majesty, which had been edited out of the medley and was meant to be discarded, but which the second engineer Jeff Emmerich, in error, taped onto the end of the master reel. McCartney, when he heard the master, decided to leave it on. The album ends after the great coda of the end on this small, slightly throwaway, unaccompanied acoustic miniature about the Queen, sung in 2 takes. It is, in its way, the perfect ending. It releases the listener gently after the great farewell with a small joke. The last day on which all 4 of them recorded together was the 20th of August, 1969, at the final session for Abbey Road. They overdubbed a few things and listened back to the masters. None of them said anything at the time about it being the last day. None of them, by their later accounts, knew for certain that it was. But it was. None of the 4 of them was ever in a recording studio, working on a Beatles record. All together again. Abbey Road was released on the 26th of September, 1969. The cover, photographed by Ian Macmillan in a single 10-minute session on the morning of the 8th of August, showed the 4 of them walking in single file across the zebra crossing on Abbey Road outside the studio. The crossing has been, ever since, one of the most photographed pieces of street furniture in the world. The record went immediately to number 1. It is, by many measures, the most musically polished thing they ever made. It is also, in a way that they could feel, and that the listener can feel, a goodbye. Chapter 12. The End. The end, when it came in pieces. In September of 1969, a few days after Abbey Road was finished, and before it had even been released, John flew with Yoko to Toronto to perform with a hastily assembled group, which he was calling the Plastic Ono Band, at a rock and roll revival concert. He had with him Eric Clapton on guitar, Klaus Voormann, his old Hamburg friend, on bass, and a young drummer named Alan White. The performance went well. On the flight home, John told the others, in a small business meeting at Apple a few days later, that he wanted, in his words, a divorce. He was leaving the Beatles. Alan Klein, who had by then been managing the band's affairs for some months, persuaded him to keep the announcement private, on the grounds that Klein was in the middle of renegotiating the band's record contract with EMI, and an announcement of the breakup would weaken his negotiating position. John agreed to keep quiet for the moment. He kept quiet for the next 6 months. The question of who was managing the Beatles had been, by then, the most divisive question in the band's life for nearly a year. Brian Epstein's death had left a hole no one had been able to fill. NEMS, the management company Brian had run, had been muddled along by his brother Clive without conviction. By late 1968, with Apple Corps hemorrhaging money and the band's affairs in a state of considerable disarray, John had announced in an interview that the Beatles, if things went on as they had been, would be broke in 6 months. The line caught the attention of an American businessman named Alan Klein, a hard-driving, plain-spoken, working-class figure from Newark, New Jersey, who had built a career renegotiating record contracts on behalf of artists and who had recently been managing the Rolling Stones. Klein contacted John and on the 28th of January 1969 met with him and Yoko at the Dorchester Hotel in London. By the end of the meeting, John had asked Klein to represent his interests. Within a few weeks, George and Ringo, whose working-class instincts inclined them more to Klein than to the alternative, had agreed. The alternative was the New York entertainment lawyer Lee Eastman. the father of Linda Eastman, whom Paul McCartney had recently begun seeing and whom he married on the 12th of March, 1969. Lee, with his son John Eastman, ran a respected entertainment law practice. Paul wanted them to manage the Beatles. The other three did not. They felt with some justification that the Eastmans would always put Paul's interests first, since Paul was now their son-in-law and brother-in-law. After a series of rancorous meetings in April of 1969, the band agreed 3-1 to appoint Klein as manager and the Eastmans as lawyers. Paul, outvoted, refused to sign the management contract. He posed for a photograph with the others and Klein, pretending to sign. He never did. The 3-1 split in management would never be repaired. Klein did, in fact, what he had been hired to do. He renegotiated the Beatles' royalty rate with EMI and Capitol upward to the highest rates of any artists then under contract. He restructured Apple. He cut the staff. He cleaned up the books. The financial picture improved sharply through 1969. But Paul, who had not signed, was paying Klein his percentage all the same, on every record he made, including any solo records. Paul did not like Klein personally. Paul did not trust Klein. And Paul, by the end of 1969, was beginning to plan how to extricate himself. In the autumn of 1969, Paul retreated with Linda and her daughter Heather and their new baby Mary to a remote farm in Scotland that he had bought some years earlier as a refuge. He was, by his own account, depressed. The band he had loved and built and held together for 7 years had, in some real way, ended without anyone announcing it had ended. He drank. He grew a beard. He worked slowly on songs of his own, which he recorded by himself on a 4-track tape recorder in his London house when he travelled down. The album he was making was called simply McCartney. In April of 1970, Apple was preparing to release the Let It Be album and film. Paul was preparing to release his own first solo album. The release dates were a problem. The other 3 Beatles, advised by Klein, wanted Paul's solo record delayed so that it would not interfere with Let It Be. Paul, livid, refused. Ringo was sent gently to Paul's house in St. John's Wood to deliver the message. Paul threw him out. The decision was reversed. Paul's record was released on schedule. Paul, however, had decided that he had had enough. Rather than do the press interviews that normally accompanied a new release, he prepared a written question and answer document to be included in the press kit that went out with the record. The Q&A, drafted by Paul himself with the help of Apple's Peter Brown, was a short, dry document. Among the questions, did he plan a new album with the Beatles? His answer was no. Were the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership likely to become active again? His answer was no. Was his break with the Beatles temporary or permanent? His answer was simply that he did not know. The Q&A went out with advance copies of the McCartney album on the 9th of April, 1970. The next morning, the 10th of April, the front page of the Daily Mirror read, in large letters, "Paul quits the Beatles." The wire services picked it up. Within a few hours, every newspaper in the world was reporting that the Beatles had broken up. John was furious. He had, after all, been the one who had announced, in private, 6 months earlier, that he was leaving. He had been holding his peace for what he saw as the band's commercial good. Paul, in his view, had now stolen the announcement. Paul, for his part, had not announced anything. He had answered some questions in a press kit. The headlines had done the rest. What followed was not technically the legal end of the partnership. The 4 of them were still, in formal terms, business partners through Apple Corp. Paul, after months of further wrangling, came finally to the conclusion that the only way to free himself from Klein and from the partnership was to file a lawsuit against the other three. He did so in the London High Court on the 31st of December 1970, asking for the dissolution of the Beatles' business partnership. The case dragged on for 3 years. The receivership it triggered eventually forced Klein out. The four of them would not formally dissolve the legal partnership until 1975. But the band, as a working creative entity, had ended on the day in April of 1970, when the headline had appeared. The record they had been working on at Twickenham 18 months earlier had, by the time it was released in May of 1970, become a posthumous artifact. They were each by then 29 or 30 years old. They had been between them a band in some recognizable form for 13 years. They had recorded 13 studio albums. They had played, by Mark Lewison's careful count, more than 1,400 concerts. They had done more or less every public thing it was possible for a band to do. They had also, somehow, in the same span of time, become 4 separate adults who could no longer find, between them, the room to be in the same band. What they had made in those 13 years had no precedent in popular music. It would almost certainly have no successor. They walked off that spring in different directions and went on with their lives. A closing. There is a tendency at the end of a Beatles story to want to chase the four of them into the long aftermath, to follow John to the Dakota apartment building in New York, to follow Paul into Wings and the great late 20th century touring life that followed, to follow George into the slow, careful, devotional records of his post-Beatles years, to follow Ringo into the easy, agreeable life he made of being Ringo. There is a great deal of story still to tell in each of those 4 directions, and other people have told it and will tell it again. But our story stops here. It stops in the spring of 1970 in a London office with a press kit and a headline, and 4 young men who could not any more be in the same room. What they had made by then sat on shelves all over the world. The records were already, by the time they ended, working their way into the rooms and the cars and the kitchen radios of every country that had electricity. They are still working their way into rooms now. There is, somewhere on the planet tonight, a child hearing Here Comes the Sun for the first time. There is, somewhere, a person in their 20s discovering Tomorrow Never Knows and feeling for an unmeasured moment that the world is larger than they had thought. There is, somewhere, a quiet kitchen in which In My Life is playing, and the person in the kitchen is remembering someone they have lost. The records have, in the great phrase, passed into the common weather. They are not anymore the property of the 4 men who wrote them. They are everyone's. Listen on a long quiet evening to a Beatles record from the early days, and then to one from the middle, and then to one from the end. The journey from Please Please Me to Abbey Road took less than 7 years. It is one of the strangest and most compressed creative journeys in the history of any art. They began as a band that played for screaming teenagers in the cavern in the lunch hour. They ended as a band that walked, in single file, across a zebra crossing in St. John's Wood, having made a body of music that an entire civilization is still listening to. So we leave them there, 4 young men in their late 20s, in the soft early summer light of 1970, on a London street they had made famous, walking out of a building. They are tired. They are no longer, as they had been a few years earlier, of one mind. They are not even, in any practical sense, friends in the way they had been. But they are still, in their own way, 4 boys from Liverpool who had once met in the back garden of a small church on a summer afternoon, and had decided that they were going to do this thing together. and had done it. The records are on the shelf, the needle is on the groove, the tape, somewhere in a vault on Abbey Road, is in its tin, and the music, which is what they made, and which is what survived, plays. Good night now, sleep well, and let the last thing in your ear, as you drift away, be the sound of a guitar, somewhere in a quiet studio on a London evening, playing softly into the long good night.